All right, boys and girls, we are going to read the next few chapters of our Read Aloud, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Chapter 8, 2 more golden tickets found. That evening, Mr. Bucket's newspaper announces the findings of not only the 3rd golden ticket, but the 4th as well. 2 golden tickets found today, screamed the headlines. Only 1 more left. All right, said Grandpa Joe when the whole family was gathered in the old people's room after supper. Let's hear who found them. The 3rd ticket, read Mr. Bucket, holding the newspaper up close to his face because his eyes were so bad and he couldn't afford glasses. The 3rd ticket was found by a Miss Violet Beauregard. There was a great excitement in the Beauregard household when the reporters arrived to interview the lucky young lady. Cameras were clicking and flashbulbs were flashing and people were pushing and jostling and trying to get a bit closer to the famous girl. And the famous girl was standing on a chair in the living room, waving a golden ticket madly at arm's length, as though she were flagging a taxi. She was talking very fast and very loudly to everyone, but it was not easy to hear all that she said because she was chewing so ferociously upon a piece of gum at the same time. I'm a gum chewer normally, she shouted, but when I heard about these golden ticket things of Mr. Wonka's, I laid off the gum and switched to candy bars in hope of striking lucky. Now, of course, I'm right back on the gum. I just adore gum. I can't do without it. I munch it all day long, except for a few minutes at meal times when I take it out, stick it behind my ear for safekeeping. To tell you the honest truth, I simply wouldn't feel comfortable if I didn't have the little wedge of gum to chew on every moment of the day. I really wouldn't. My mother says it's not ladylike, and it looks ugly to see girls' jaws going up and down like mine do all the time. But I don't agree. And who's she to criticize anyway? Because if you ask me, I'd say her jaws are going up and down almost as much as mine are, just from yelling at me every minute of the day. Now, Violet, said Miss Beauregard from the corner of the room where she was standing on the piano to avoid being trampled by the mob. All right, mother, keep your hair on, Miss Beauregard shouted. And now, she went on, turning to the reporters again, and it may interest you to know that this piece of gum I'm chewing right at this moment is the one I've been working on for over 3 months solid. That's a record, that is. I've beaten the record held by my best friend, Miss Cornelia Primsmental, and she was mad. It was the most treasured possession now, this piece of gum is. At nights, I just stick it on the end of my bedpost, and it is good as ever in the morning. It's a bit hard at first, maybe, but it will soon soften up again after I've given it a few good chews. Before I start chewing for the world record, I used to change my piece of gum once a day. I used to do it in the elevator on the way home from school. Why the elevator? Because I like sticking into the gooey piece I like sticking the gooey piece that I just finished with onto the one of the elevator buttons. The next person who comes along and pressed the button got my old gum on the end of his or her finger. Ha ha. And what a racket they kick up, some of them. You get the best results with women who have expensive gloves on. Oh, yes, I'm thrilled to be going to Mr. Wonka's factory, and I understand that afterwards he's going to give me enough gum to last me the rest of my whole life. Whoopee hooray. Beastly girl, said Grandma Josephine. Despicable, said Grandma Georgina. She'll come to a sticky end, that one, chewing all that gum. You see if she doesn't. And who's got the 4th golden ticket, Daddy? Charlie asked. Now let me see. Mr. Bucket was peering over at the newspaper again. Ah, yes, here we are. The 4th golden ticket, he read, was found by a boy called Mike TV. Another bad lot, I'll be bound, muttered Grandma Josephine. Don't interrupt, Grandma, said Mrs. Bucket. The TV household, said Mr. Bucket, going on with his reading, was crammed like all the others with excited visitors when reporters arrived, but young Mike TV, the lucky winner, seemed extremely annoyed by the whole business. Can't you fools see I'm watching television, he said angrily. I wish you wouldn't interrupt. The 9-year-old boy was seated before an enormous television set with his eyes glued to the screen, and he was watching a film in which one of the gangsters was shooting up another bunch of gangsters with a machine gun. Mike TV himself had no less than 18 toy pistols of various sizes hanging from his belt and around his body, and every now and again he would leap up into the air and fire off half a dozen rounds from one or another of these weapons. Quiet, he shouted when someone tried to ask him a question. Didn't I tell you not to interrupt? This show is the absolute whiz-banger. It's terrific. I watch it every day. I watch all of them every day, even the crummy ones where there's no shooting. I like the gangsters best. They're terrific, those gangsters, especially when they start pumping each other full of lead or flashing the old stilettos, or giving each other the 1, 2, 3 with their knuckle dusters. Oh boy, what I wouldn't give to be doing this myself. It's the life, I tell you. It's terrific. That's quite enough, snapped Grandma Josephine. I can't bear to listen to it. Nor me, said Grandma Georgina. Do all children behave like that nowadays? Like these brats we've been hearing about? Of course not, said Mr. Bucket, smiling at the old lady on the end of the bed. Some do, of course, and in fact, quite a lot of them do, but not all of them. And now there's only one ticket left, said Grandpa George. Quite so, sniffed Grandma Georgina. And just as sure as I'll be having cabbage soup for supper tomorrow, that ticket will go to some nasty little beast who doesn't deserve it. Chapter 9. Grandpa Joe Takes a Gamble. The next day when Charlie came home from school and went to see his grandparents, he found that only Grandpa Joe was awake. The other three were all snoring loudly. Shh, whispered Grandpa Joe, and he beckoned Charlie to come closer. Charlie tiptoed over and stood beside the bed. The old man gave Charlie a sly grin, and then he started rummaging under his pillow with one hand. And when the hand came out again, there was an ancient leather purse clutched in his fingers. Under the cover of the bedcloth, the old man opened the purse and tipped it out upside down. Out fell a single silver 10-cent piece. It's my secret hoard, he whispered. The others don't know I've got it. And now you and I are going to have one more fling at finding the last ticket. How about it, eh? But you'll have to help me. Are you sure you want to spend your money on that, Grandpa? Charlie whispered. Of course I'm sure, spluttered the old man excitedly. Don't stand there arguing. I'm just as crazy as you are to find that ticket. Here, take the money and run down to the street to the nearest store and buy the first Wonka candy bar you see and bring it straight back to me and we'll open it together. Charlie took the little silver coin and slipped it quickly out of the room, and in 5 minutes he was back. Have you got it? Whispered Grandpa Joe, his eyes shining with excitement. Charlie nodded and held up the bar of candy. Wonka's Nutty Crunch Surprise, it said on the wrapper. Good, the old man whispered, sitting up in bed and rubbing his hands. Now come over here and sit close to me and we'll open it together. Are you ready? Yes, Charlie said. I'm ready. All right, you tear off the first bit. No, Charlie said. You pay for it. You do it all. The old man's fingers were trembling most terribly as they fumbled with the candy bar. We don't have a hope, really, he whispered, giggling a bit. You know, we don't even have a hope, don't you? Yes, Charlie said. I know that. They looked at each other and they both started to giggle nervously. Mind you, said Grandpa Joe, there is just that tiny chance that you might be the one that won, don't you agree? Yes, Charlie said. Of course. Why don't you open it, Grandpa? All in good time, my boy, all in good time. Which end do you think we should open first? That corner, the furthest one from you. Just tear it off a tiny bit, but not quite enough for us to see anything. Like that, the old man said. Yes, now a little bit more. You finish it, said Grandpa Joe. I'm too nervous. No, Grandpa, you must do it yourself. Very well then, here goes. He tore off the wrapper and they both stared at what lay underneath. It was a bar of candy, nothing more. At once they both saw the funny side of the whole thing and burst into peals of laughter. What the heck's going on? Cried Grandma Josephine, waking up suddenly. Nothing, said Grandpa Joe. You go on back to sleep. Chapter 10. The family begins to starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw huge flakes drifting slowly down out of an icy sky that was the color of steel. By evening, it lay 4 feet deep and around the tiny house. Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping. And oh, how bitter cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice. And each time he stepped outside, the door of the wind was like a knife on his cheeks. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing through the sides of the window, under the doors, and there was no place to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long since been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except two vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich, steaming stews and hot apple pies, and all the kinds of delicious warm dishes. And because we are all a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because the family couldn't afford it. And as the cold weather went on and on, he became ravishingly and desperately hungry. Both bars of candy, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away, and all that he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. And then all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory where Mr. Bucket worked suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets, but it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that the 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everybody in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would pass Mr. Wonka's giant chocolate factory, and every day he came near to it, he would lift his small pointed nose in the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on the end, taking a deep swallowing breath, as though he were trying to eat the smell itself. That child, said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from underneath the blankets one icy morning, that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with. But a growing boy, he can't go on like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton. What can one do, murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at breakfast this morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back. He's a fine little fellow, said Grandpa George. He deserves better than this. The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was drawn so tightly over the cheeks that he could see the shapes of the bones underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go on much longer like this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with the curious wisdom that seems to come so often to small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did, so to save his strength. In the morning, he left the house 10 minutes earlier so that he could walk slowly to school without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during recess, resting himself, while others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then one afternoon, walking back from home with an icy wind in his face, and incidentally feeling hungrier than he ever had before, his eyes was caught suddenly by a piece of paper lying on the in the gutter in the snow. The paper was of the greenish color, and there was something vaguely familiar about it. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried underneath the snow, but he saw it at once. It was a $1 bill. Quickly, he looked around him. He had somebody dropped it? No, that was impossible because of the way it was part of it buried. Several people went hurrying past him on the sidewalks, their chins sunk deep in their coats and their feet crunching in the snow. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of the small boy crouching in the gutter. Then it was his, this dollar. Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it up from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole $1. He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him at that moment, only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper stationery store, the kind that sells almost everything, including candy and cigars. And what would he do? He whispered quickly to himself. He would buy one luscious bar of candy and eat it all up, every bit of it, right then and there. And the rest of the money he would take straight back home and give it to his mother.